Bruce here. Today we're going to talk about the book of Leviticus. And starting in Leviticus, it was written by Moses again in 1450 BC, around the same time as Genesis and Exodus. The purpose of Leviticus was for it to be a handbook to the priests and Levites, describing what their duties were for worship. And it also was a guidebook for how the Hebrews should live in a holy way. The contents of the book include worshiping the holy God, which is really found within verses 1 through 17, and highlights instructions for the priests, the offerings, the people, and the altar, and then living a holy life, which is found between verses 18 through 27, and that defines the standards for the people, rules for the priests, how they should receive the blessing of God, and then how they should handle seasons and festivals that come up. And really the celebration of what it is to worship God. From the the book itself, God gave Moses specific instructions for how to sacrifice sheep, ox, goats, birds, or grain to God, and each one had a special meaning. Rules for burnt offerings were also given, and God instructed Moses and Aaron to tell the people what food to eat. Any animal with a split hoof, or what we call a cloven hoof, which chews the cud, is found in Leviticus 11, 2 through 3, and this meant that camels, rabbits, and pigs were not supposed to be eaten. Also, it was right to eat any animal that had fish or scales, which is found in Leviticus 11:9, but no other water creatures. Some birds, like eagles, ravens, hawks, owls, gulls, and bats, were also forbidden to eat, along with insects. The law also said that God wished for the Hebrews were told to Moses. Homosexuality, a big topic in today's life, was forbidden, and that can be found in Leviticus 18:22. And specific details on holy feasts were also given for observing. That can be found in Leviticus 23. The year of Jubilee was explained, and it was the every 50th year, Leviticus 25:10, where all debts were forgiven and land was passed back to its original owners, or whoever was the original heir. And God constantly promises to remind everyone that he remembers the promise of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this can be found in Leviticus 26, verse 42, and is often referred to as God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Leviticus, for the most part, basically outlines the things that the Lord gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. In summary, Leviticus is about sacrifice or an offering. The sacrifice was for worship and forgiveness of sin. Through them, we learn about the cost of sin, for what we see that cannot be forgiven ourselves. God's system says that a life must be given for a life. The eye for eye basically meant a fair punishment for the crime. In the Old Testament, an animal's life was to be given to save the life of a person, but this was only a temporary measure until later on in the New Testament, Jesus' death paid the penalty of sin for all people forever. As we look at worship, God's rules about worship did set up a regular, orderly pattern for worship with Him and fellowship with Him. They allowed times for celebration and thanksgiving, as well as reverence and rededication. Our worship should really demonstrate deep devotion. When we look at health, we need to be different than the people around us that don't believe. Principles for a healthy living are as important today as they were in Moses' time. A healthy environment and a healthy body make our service to God that much more effective. And holiness. We need to dedicate every area of our life to God. He desires absolute obedience in motives as well as practices. Though we don't observe the worship practices of traditional Israel, we're supposed to have the same spirit of preparation and devotion that they did. And then finally, the Levites, who were servants. Now, the Levites were one of the 12 tribes, and they showed Israel the way to God. But the interesting thing about them is they provide a really good historical backdrop for Christ, who was our high priest, yet at the same time our servant. God's true servant care for all the needs of our people. And so with that, that's the book of Leviticus in 10 minutes or less.